Good evening, welcome. My name is Sebastian Burka. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Council. We're thrilled to have a great audience tonight, and we're delighted to welcome back Lord King to our platform. This time in conversation with Ms. Bethany McLean on his new book, The End of Alchemy, Money, Banking, and the Future of the Global Economy. And the book is available for purchase and signing after the end of the event in the back of the room. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Zurich, for their continued support of this important series. This spring, as part of the series, we hosted Professor Tyler Cohen and Randy Krosner and Luigi Zingales. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please know that this event is on the record, so feel free to use social media, but please remember to silence your phones. And we are live streaming. I'd like to highlight a few upcoming programs in the spring season. On April 5th, we have Danny Roderick from Harvard on emerging markets. On April 11th, we have Jaime Caruana, the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements and the former governor of the Bank of Spain, who will speak on sovereign bond markets, negative interest rates, and their implications for the global economy. And on April 29th, we are hosting Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek Minister of Finance, on the situation in Europe, so that should be an interesting conversation. We have many other programs, so please check our website. And as you know, Council programs are membership supported, so thank you for those who are already members. If you are not a member, the membership starts at $100. Please speak to my colleagues in the back about that. And to celebrate March Madness, the Council is offering 25% off membership this month for university, faculty, students, and staff only. Sorry. And for additional information on this offer, please see my colleagues again in the back. I will rejoin to moderate the Q&A, but now I'd like to welcome to the stage to introduce our speakers, Ambassador Louis Sussman. He's the former US Ambassador to the United Kingdom and a valued member of our board. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sussman.
Thank you very much. It's our usual wonderful weather here in Chicago. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, I would like to thank all of you for joining us in this third installment of the Spring Global Economy Series sponsored by Zurich. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Lord King in conversations with Bethany McLean to discuss money, banking, and the future of the global economy. As you may know, the modern financial system centered on money and banks has facilitated an unprecedented level of economic growth in the last 2 centuries. However, it has also produced a long string of economic disasters, including hyperinflation, deflation, bank collapses, the recent global recession, and the current stagnation of in many parts of the world. Lord King knows the global financial system firsthand in his long and distinguished career, including 10 years at the helm of the Bank of England. He was also at the height during those 10 years of the financial crisis, and he became intimately knowledgeable on the mechanics of a capitalistic society. Given the advantages and also the potential pitfalls of global finance, what must be done to clear the path for a capitalist society? Given the advantages, but also the potential pitfalls of global finance, what must be done to make our economy durable? This evening, I look forward to the insightful discussions on these topics with Lord King and Ms. McLean. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce the speakers. Mervyn King, Lord King, I've known quite closely for the last 7-8 years. When I was ambassador, he tried very, very hard to teach me about cricket, and I failed. I think he even bought me a book called Cricket for Dummies, and it was one of his few failures in life. The one question that is out of bounds tonight, do not ask him about his favorite football team, Aston Villa, which is presently in last place in the Premier League. Lord King is currently a professor of economics at New York University's Stern School of Business and is a professor of law at the NYU School of Law. He is also the school professor of economics at the London School of Economics. He was appointed a life peer for his contributions to public service and entered the UK House of Lords in July of 2013. I don't know if it's significant, but I left my post in August of 2013 and was made a Knight of the Garter, which is one of the highest orders the Queen can bestow on a lord. Lord King has served as a governor of the Bank of England from 2003 to 2013, and during his 22 career as the institution, he also served as the deputy governor, the chief economist, and the executive director. I want to add one very, very personal note to this introduction. I was fortunate to meet so many people in my 4 years as ambassador, and I never met one wiser than Lord King. With unabashed candor, his views that he gave me as a representative of the United States government was the wisest, most thoughtful views we ever got. And I would honestly say we were very lucky to have him give his views tonight. Bethany is currently a contributing editor in Vanity Fair and a contributor to CNBC. She was previously an editor-at-large at Fortune. She is presently, I believe, an investigative journalist known for her work on the Enron scandal and the 2008 financial crisis, and has co-authored several books. Prior to joining Fortune, she was an investment analyst with Goldman Sachs. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming these two people for a terrific evening.
So semi-randomly this morning, a friend of mine, another economist named David Zervos, emailed me, and he said this about your book. I couldn't put it down. So far, in my opinion, he has written the best, this is in capitals, post-crisis book. It was simply fantastic. So a lot has been written about the financial crisis.
You have very good friends.
A lot has been written about the financial crisis, and a lot has been written about economics since the financial crisis. Why write a book?
Well, there were lots of books already there, and I decided not to write another account of the crisis and not a memoir, because the historians will write the definitive account, and to describe my role in it, any rational reader would say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So I decided to do something different, and the reason was that my experience was that my own views about economics and about central banks changed as a result of the crisis, and I wanted to explore that. But the trigger, actually, for the book was a meeting I had in Beijing with my opposite number, who took me to the state guest house in Beijing for dinner, and it was a splendid banquet, and I got rather carried away, and I said, well, he would remember the remark attributed to Zhou Enlai, who, when asked what he thought of the French Revolution, was reported to have said, too soon to tell, though Henry Kissinger denies that. But I wanted to ask my friend what he thought of the Industrial Revolution, because 500 years ago, China was the richest, most prosperous economy in the world, and yet it fell behind the West. And the Industrial Revolution started in my country, very much in my hometown in the West Midlands, and I wanted to know what the Chinese made of it. And he said something very interesting. He said, we've studied the experience of the West, the benefits of competition and a market economy to boost productivity and living standards, and we want to emulate that. And then he paused, and then he looked at me and said, but I'm not quite sure if you in the West have quite got the hang of money and banking yet. So I wanted to explore what it was about money and banking that had produced not just the crisis in 2008, but a whole series of crises right through history, which had somewhat overshadowed, in part, the enormous impact of rising growth and living standards that we'd seen since the mid-18th century when the Industrial Revolution started.
And we're going to come back to that, but I want to pause on this notion that the crisis changed your view of economics. And you became chief economist of the Bank of England in 1991. You were there for 23 years. But am I right in describing you as an economist who sees a lot wrong with economics? You begin the book with this wonderful quote from T.S. Eliot: "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?"
So I think what hit me after the crisis was, I went back and read some of the books from the 1930s, Maynard Keynes's General Theory, much of which I found very hard to understand even now. Bits of it are very illuminating. And what struck me was that the essence of what Keynes was saying was that unlike modern economics, he said, the key elements of the future that matter in explaining booms and slumps are the fact that the future is inherently unknowable. And if it's unknowable, we can't, in some sense, attach probabilities to future events. And if we can't do that, we can't price the risks. And I think where modern economics and finance went a little bit off the rails, I mean, it's useful in many contexts, but in trying to understand booms and slumps, the idea that all risks can be priced, and just by creating more and more financial instruments and more financial markets, we'll have priced and therefore can manage risk, is wrong. And crises occur when something wholly unexpected happens that people didn't anticipate before. And if you mistakenly think that you've calculated all the risks correctly, you'll be taken by surprise and you could easily become insolvent. And the real key to making the financial system safer is not to calculate the risks beforehand, but to realize that something you can't calculate could happen, and ask yourself, how could we make the system resilient to this sort of unexpected outcome?
You talk in the book about this concept of radical uncertainty, and one of the things you pause on is the difference between risk and uncertainty.
Yes.
And maybe you can explain that.
Well, this is the essence of it, that risk, Frank Knight, many great Chicago economists were very clear that risk is where you can write down the list of all the things that could happen, you can attach probabilities to them, and because you can do that, you appear to be able to manage risk, and modern economics assumes that you can optimize your behavior. You don't know exactly what will happen in the future, but you know what could happen, and you know what the probabilities of various things are. So you can, in some sense, optimize over them. Uncertainty is where you have no idea what could happen. Radical uncertainty is we don't know what could happen, so we can't create markets in this, we can't price it, and that's the sort of situation in which a market economy is not self-stabilizing. That's the essence of what Keynes was driving at. And he got very upset when, classical economists would say, well, unemployment, you cut wages, increase the demand for labor, unemployment goes away. And Keynes said, no, you don't understand. In a world of uncertainty, if you cut wages, all you may do is change people's beliefs about how well off they'll be in the future. And it has complete relevance to today, because now the issue is not cutting wages, it's cutting interest rates. And most economists believe that if only we could cut interest rates far enough, then people would spend today, because they would have a big incentive to spend today rather than in the future. And my point is that if you were to announce that this year there'll be a wealth tax of 5% on all assets denominated in money terms, that's equivalent to a real interest rate of minus 5%. Most economists would say this will increase spending and we'll get a recovery. I think that if you were to announce we'll have a wealth tax of 5% on all these monetary assets, people might well respond by saying, what on earth are these people doing? And what on earth are they going to do next year? And we don't know. And the sheer uncertainty that's created by that sort of government policy can, far from leading people to spend more, could lead them to spend less. And that's why radical uncertainty, I think, is so important.
So I want to come back to that, but you write, I want to give you a challenge first of all. You write in the book that the financial crisis, the story of what happened, can be explained in little more than a few pages, everything you knew but were afraid to ask. So okay, game time challenge. Can you do it in 2 minutes on the stage?
Fall of the Berlin Wall. Many people said the end of communism, end of history. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the biggest crisis of capitalism. China believed in a market economy, export-led strategy. That means they saved a lot. They saved so much that interest rates in the world kept falling. As interest rates go down, if nothing else changes, asset prices go up. House prices, stock prices, prices of fine art, everything. When asset prices go up, in order to buy them, people have to borrow more. Debt went up. Banks issued that debt, not because they forced it on people, because people wanted to borrow. Banks themselves had to borrow in order to lend, and they became very highly fragile. They had high leverage ratios. It only required a small change to mean the banks would start to become insolvent, or people were worried about them. People lose confidence in banks. Big bank run 2008. Enter the Fed.
I think you did it. So there's always been this question about the financial crisis. Was it solvency or was it illiquidity? And that's a question in every crisis, right? And you write in the book, at last there was an acceptance among governments and among at least some banks that the crisis reflected not just a shortage of liquidity, but a much deeper problem of insufficient capital. I still hear this point argued, particularly by America's big banks. Why is this such a tough question in the moment, and why is it such a tough question even after the fact?
So I think the way to put it, and this is where I disagree completely with the thrust of much international regulation. Ask the question, how much equity finance did a bank have to issue? How much capital did it need in order to persuade other people to put their money into banks so they could lend to finance the real economy? Well, we know the answer to that before the crisis, which was hardly any, because they had such high leverage ratios that we know they didn't need to have much capital in the good times before the crisis. After the crisis, what was very striking was the answer to the question of how much equity capital did banks need to have to attract funds into them was a hell of a lot, and actually far more than the regulators were proposing that banks issue. This illustrates that there is no mathematical calculation of how much equity capital a bank needs to have. And in the good times, almost any required amount of capital by regulators will seem too much and too tough, and in a crisis it will seem too little. And this big swing in sentiment creates the problem. And when that swing in sentiment occurred in the autumn of 2007, it became clear that banks had created such high leverage that they were not only very fragile, but that people were going to be pretty reluctant to roll over their lending to banks. So the concern about solvency was creating the liquidity problem. And those banks that thought, oh, it's just a question of having access to more borrowing, were mistaken, because what they couldn't do was to increase confidence in their own balance sheets. And it was very striking in the crisis that those banks that went out and issued more equity capital attracted the confidence of investors and hence the funds which they could then use to lend out. Now, both are important, and in terms of reforming banking, we have to think about both solvency and liquidity. But it was a big mistake for people to pretend that in the crisis, just a little bit more lending to banks would solve the problem.
So you have a lovely line in the book where you talk about how the crisis wasn't stressful because you had such a wonderful team working with you. Well, first of all, really? But second, no stressful moments. But secondly, if not a stressful moment, how about a really surreal moment?
So there were some very odd moments in the crisis, that's true. But I mean, it was true, and I genuinely felt that whatever happened, the team of people around me, especially the young people around me in my office, were so supportive and so bright that when I left the office every night, I knew that whatever happened, they'd do the right thing. So it was a very demanding job, and it was tiring, that's true. And it was sort of endless. We didn't get any holidays for a long time, but it wasn't stressful. You know, I always felt stress is is what happens when you lose your job. You've got a family to support, they depend on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's stress. So most of the things that seem surreal in the crisis actually had to do with transport of various kinds. And one moment I'll never forget, which was the 2009 London G20 summit was perhaps the high point of international cooperation. And it was downhill thereafter. But in the run-up to that summit, Britain had the presidency of the G20 that year, and Gordon Brown, it was the peak moment in his premiership, and he hosted that summit. But Angela Merkel was very keen to have a pre-summit meeting of all the European members of the G20 in Berlin to get her share of the glory. And we were summoned to Berlin on a Sunday, end of February 2009. And it was just the European members, and it was just from each country, Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Central Bank Governor. So it was a small meeting. And we had to fly, secretly. So we went to the military airport in Northolt in London, and we were to fly to Berlin and go to the military side of the airport there. And so I went Sunday morning to Northolt Airport, and the Treasury official who was accompanying us said, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. King, we've a slight change of plan. The aircraft of the royal flight that we had planned to take is no longer available. For some reason, I thought it's a bit odd. I mean, it was a Prime Minister, Chancellor. The word golf was mentioned, but I never quite understood why it was the plane wasn't available. Anyway, don't worry, he said. We have got a replacement plane. So the idea was that Gordon Brown would be collected in this plane. He'd fly down to London, pick Alistair Darling and myself up, and we'd go out to Berlin. So the plane came in, and I noticed it was a rather small plane, but then, we didn't have a large party, so that seemed all right. But this tiny plane taxied in to where we were waiting, and along the side of the fuselage, I could see written, Tyrolean Airways. And this Treasury civil servant, in best Treasury fashion, had gone on the internet on the Saturday afternoon, and the best plane he could come up with was a charter plane from the Austrian Tyrolean Airways. And we got on, and this plane came with a very charming air hostess who was dressed in Tyrolean national costume. And she was very charming and handed us little Mozart Kugel chocolates on the flight. And we got to Berlin, and as we landed, I noticed that there were two gigantic 747 jumbo jets waiting at the corner where we were supposed to taxi towards. One had the French tricolour on the tailplane, and the other, bizarrely, had come from Spain. Spain wasn't in the G20, but Angela was keen to invite her friends to come along. So as we taxied towards these planes, and then we stopped, and the air hostess carefully lowered these very creaky steps down to the ground. And as we clambered carefully down the steps, we noticed the French and Spanish delegations waiting for us so that we could all go together in convoy to the Chancellery in Berlin. And I will never forget, to my dying day, the look on Nicolas Sarkozy's face as the President of France, standing by his country's 747 jet, watched the British delegation clamber down these steps from a plane which had Tyrolean Airways written on the side. And we stood there at the bottom and turned round and waved goodbye to our air hostess in Tyrolean national costume. And you could see Sarkozy's face, I knew the British were eccentric, but surely not this eccentric.
Okay, back to weightier, albeit less amusing matters. So if you ever asked Treasury Secretary, our former Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, after the crisis about the issue of too big to fail, he would point out that American banks, as measured by market cap as a percentage of GDP, were much smaller than banks in Europe, than banks in Canada, than banks in Asia. You have a remarkable statistic in your book that JP Morgan today accounts for almost the same proportion of US banking as all of the top 10 banks put together in 1960. And you asked this question, but is the banking sector now too large? What do you think?
So I think it is, and I think it's been encouraged to become too big. I think we should draw comfort from the fact that the market itself now is leading to some reduction in banks. I mean, Goldman Sachs is smaller than it was. Investment banking as an activity is less profitable. The market is giving signals which are leading banks to respond. And the extreme case in Switzerland, their two biggest banks became investment banks. Now they basically abandoned that and are switching themselves back into wealth management. But I think my biggest difference of view from what I'll call the US Treasury approach was that I spend 3 months a year living in New York now, and I know that New York fire engines are very big and make a lot of noise, and when there's a fire, boy, do they put it out. And this was the approach in the crisis of the Treasury and the Fed. Throw a lot of money at it and douse the fire. And once the fire started, that's exactly the right thing to do. But what I noticed was that afterwards, the temptation was to take the fire engine back to the firehouse, lock it up, and go and do something else, and then wait for the next fire. And I don't think that's the right approach. So one of the proposals in the book is that what we have to do is to make banks take out insurance in good times so that it then seems not only sensible, but actually fair and equitable for us to, if you like, pay out on the insurance by lending to banks during the crisis. And I think much of the anger that has occurred in the crisis will be avoided if people felt that banks were having to pay insurance in good times in order to be given access to central bank liquidity when there's a crisis. And we don't let motorists drive on the road without taking out insurance beforehand. We don't let them take out insurance after the crash. And it's a condition of driving that you take out insurance. And that should be a condition of banking, that banks take out sufficient insurance such that depositors would always be able to repay by banks.
Let's pause on this notion that you talk about in the book, the pawnbroker for all seasons. Can you explain that?
Well, during the crisis, central banks typically would refer to Walter Bagehot and the lender of last resort. This is a 19th century idea, which I think has now become somewhat outdated. And the reason it's outdated is because Walter Bagehot was clever enough to know that you could never tell in a crisis whether a bank was solvent or insolvent, but you had to lend against good collateral. And in his day, banks in Britain in the 19th century would have 30% or more of their balance sheet in the form of short-term government assets, against which it was completely safe for the Bank of England to lend, irrespective of whether the bank itself was ultimately solvent. So his maxim of lending freely against good collateral was an operational concept. Come 2007, when the banks came to us, the proportion of the total assets of the US banking system in this safe form were not 30%, but less than 1%. So we were in the position of a pawnbroker, someone bringing a gold watch, and we would lend less than the value of the gold watch. Now, the trouble is that we only did this in the crisis, which created two difficulties. One is that, what on earth was this collateral worth? And many of the gold watches that the banks brought to us were broken. So we didn't know how much they were really worth. And we didn't have a facility to value the collateral. And anyway, I remember, one day in 2008, Royal Bank of Scotland said to me, well, I'm terribly sorry we can't get to the end of the day. And I said, well, that's most unfortunate. And I had to basically write a check for £36 billion, something I have done once in my life and never expect to be able to do ever again. And I said to my staff, so, what are we going to lend against? What's the collateral? And they said, oh, it's sort of mortgages, really. I said, well, whose mortgages? And they said, we haven't got the faintest idea. Mrs. Jones in 17 Acacia Avenue. We didn't know where Acacia Avenue was or who Mrs. Jones was. Mm-hmm. So we were lending blind. And we were doing it because we hadn't prepared for this before the crisis. So my idea is that what you do is to say to banks, look, before the crisis, normal times, you bring some of your balance sheet, some of your assets to the central bank. The central bank will take its time to examine it and value it. And it will say to the bank, look, if at any point in the next 5 years or 10 years, you need access to an emergency credit line. We'll give you 90 cents in the dollar, perhaps, if it's fairly safe assets, or 35 cents in the dollar if it's really difficult stuff to value. And you know that's the amount you'll get from us. And here's the key. The rule that banks must obey is that they have to position with the central bank in good times sufficient collateral that at any point, if there is a crisis, unexpectedly, the bank, the central bank, and all the depositors know that the bank has access to a credit line in cash sufficient to repay all the depositors, just like that. If we could get to that point, then there'd never be a bank run again. Bank runs were the bane of the United States banking system in the 19th century. They were a massive problem in 2008. They're not just something that happened in history with old fuddy-duddies. They happen now. And we can get rid of it. Now, this may sound a bit sort of airy-fairy, but actually, in the spirit of never let a good crisis go to waste, two things have happened which make this a doable proposition now. One is that central banks actually do have teams of people capable of valuing collateral, and we mustn't disband these teams. It wasn't a crisis measure. We should make this a permanent feature of a central bank, the pawnbroker for all seasons. And the second thing that's happened is that with all this printing of electronic money, quantitative easing, what happens is that the Federal Reserve buys government bonds, say from you, Bethany, gives you a check drawn on the Fed. You take that check to your bank and deposit it. They credit your checking account, so the money supply goes up. And your commercial bank brings the check back to the Fed and says, please deposit this and increase my deposit with the Fed. So commercial banks now have large deposits with the Federal Reserve. In fact, 20% of the total assets of the American banking system are now in the form of deposits with the Federal Reserve. Long may this last, is my view, because what this means is we've now got a good chunk of potentially very valuable collateral against which the central bank can lend to a bank on the spur of the moment. And just one simple numerical example to illustrate this. Suppose a bank has a total balance sheet of 100 assets, 100 liabilities. A typical bank in the US would have some equity finance, some long-term debt finance, medium-term debt finance, and then deposits, very short-term debt, which could run from the bank and create a bank run. And that's about 60% of the liabilities. So about 60 is in the form of this runnable deposits. Look at the asset side. Well, 20 we know is in the form of deposits with the Fed, so that gives you 20 straight away. Of the other 80 of assets, now the central bank will say, we'll lend you 90 cents in the dollar, if the bank positions all of the assets with the central bank. Others may be only 50%, and some really rough stuff may be nothing. But let's suppose on average, the haircut which the central bank uses when calculating how much to lend against the assets is 50%, which I think is pretty conservative, but I think central banks should be conservative. That means that of the 80 assets, the bank knows that it will get access to 40 in a cash credit line whenever it needs it. Add the 40 to the 20 in deposits with the Fed. Hey presto, you've got 60. You've met the pawnbroker for all seasons rule. And so I think the banking system is closer to being able to reach the objective of avoiding bank runs. It's just that we haven't bothered to put in place the mechanisms to make this work. And we could do that. And then the famous Chicago plan of the 1930s, which was proposed by all the leading economists here in Chicago, which was to eliminate fractional reserve banking. And the problem with their proposal was that it meant separating very narrow banks that could never lend to business but could issue deposits from the banks that couldn't issue deposits but would have to finance risky lending. And that's far too extreme. My proposal is one in which banks should do what they're supposed to do, which is to match assets and liabilities, run their bank, subject to this one rule, which is that they must position enough collateral with the Fed such that, together with the deposits at the Fed, They'll always be able to repay deposits, and everyone will know that, so there'll never be a bank run again. We wouldn't see the calamity of 2008. There will be ups and downs of the economy, but they won't be amplified by the big disturbances in the banking system.
So one possible challenge to that is that with the merger of banks and investment banks in the United States and elsewhere, the turnover of assets is so fast that it might be hard even for a very talented analytical team at a central bank to keep up with valuation of the assets. Couldn't we get part of where you're going simply by reinstating Glass-Steagall?
Well, I think the trouble with Glass-Steagall is that the world is so complex now that the idea that legislators can decide well in advance about the precise definitions of what banks should do or should not do is probably asking too much. And I'm deeply skeptical of the merits of such detailed legislation. So it is with sheer astonishment that I read the thousands of pages of legislation on the one hand and detailed rules on the other, such that if you work in a bank, you can hardly move without consulting your compliance officer. This seems to me wholly destructive. And to create an industry of people who are either working in regulators or advising legislators or working in banks as compliance officers and lawyers is what we economists call a dead weight loss. In other words, these highly paid, talented people are very worthy, and it's not their fault, but we're paying them all this money to do something that has no social value. And I would like to say to banks, look, if you go along with a restriction on the leverage in your bank, and you accept the pawnbroker for all seasons rule, then at the end of a transition period of, say, 10 years or so to get there, then at that point, but not before, but at that point, we'll abolish an awful lot of the detailed regulation that we've got today. And I'd certainly get rid of all the detailed capital regulation and liquidity rules that the Basel International regime impose on banks.
There's a wonderful line in the book: by encouraging a culture in which compliance with detailed regulations is a defense against a charge of wrongdoing, bankers and regulators have colluded in a self-defeating spiral of complexity.
Yep.
Self-defeating spiral of complexity. It's fantastic. You have a great anecdote in the book, how at the beginning of September, central bank governors from around the world would congregate in Basel for the regular bi-monthly meeting, and the heads of the bank regulators from around the world would come every September. And you write that in the fall of 2007, the bank regulators were asked whether U.S. subprime mortgage market was sufficiently large enough to cause any problems. And the answer was this emphatic no. So what can we learn from that about the ability of regulators to foresee the future?
So I learned two things from that experience, because we, as you say, we were in Basel and all the regulators were there, and there had been problems in the markets for mortgage-backed securities, particularly subprime mortgages. So we asked a question, could this be a big thing or not? And the regulators gave a very accurate answer, which is the size of the subprime mortgage market is just not big enough to bring down the banking system. Well, it turned out that the banking system was brought down by a wider loss of confidence. So I learned two things from it. One was that at that weekend, I remember going to the UK office, and Stan Fisher, who was then governor of the Bank of Israel, now at the Fed, came to see me, and we chatted about it. And Stan said to me, he said, you know, Mervyn, once banks start to lose money in one area, it's often the case that you discover they lose money in other areas too. In other words, when something goes wrong in one area, maybe it isn't just a problem of that area, but there's a wider development in the economy where you'll discover losses popping up all over the place. That was certainly true. And the second was that what the regulators had underestimated was the significance of the market in derivative instruments. So the way I like to think of it is that where I teach at NYU in Washington Square, you can often see two old men or people willing to play tennis. And you'll see an old man playing tennis, and he'll challenge you to a tennis match for $10. And you see people playing each other for $10 chess in Washington Square. What happened in the financial crisis was that the subprime mortgage market, we are poor people borrowing sums of money which were big for them, but actually small in absolute terms. It's as if these two people playing chess in Washington Square suddenly found a big crowd of people surrounding them who'd wandered off from Wall Street and who were placing enormous bets on the outcome of this chess match. All these bets were going to cancel out, but whereas the two protagonists were playing for $10, all these people watching them were playing for billions of dollars. And the reason why it became so problematic was that although you knew that in some deep sense the positions of these derivatives would cancel out, with some people winning and some people losing, you had no idea who was going to win and who was going to lose. And as a result, since the people who were playing these games with derivatives were basically the big banks, although you knew that the banking system as a whole probably wouldn't lose vast amounts, you knew that every bank was a bank you should stay away from because you didn't know whether it was on the winning or losing side. So ironically, even though in aggregate the system wasn't facing disaster, every individual bank people lost confidence and stayed away from the banks and didn't roll over their loans to the banks. And we just teetered on the brink for 12 months with people feeling, well, maybe the banks aren't quite going to fail, and then the next week, loss of confidence again. And you could see it in the so-called LIBOR rates, the interest rates at which people were willing to lend to banks, shooting up and then coming down. And we teetered on the brink for 12 months before inevitably we fell over in September 2008.
So you talk in the book, as we've discussed a little bit, about the importance of dealing with uncertainty and this concept of radical uncertainty. And I loved this line too. The lesson is that no amount of sophisticated statistical analysis is a match for the historical experience that stuff happens.
Yes.
But it seems that you've always had an openness to that perhaps others in your profession haven't. And I thought it was really interesting when you said that sometimes when you were giving evidence to the Treasury Select Committee in the House of Commons, you'd sometimes respond to a question by saying, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know many people in your position who are actually willing to say, I don't know. Why do you think you always have been?
Well, I said I don't know because very often I didn't know. And I was always amazed at how often members of Parliament found this a completely unacceptable answer. And, they would say, well, it's your job to have a crystal ball. And I said, well, with great respect, it's not just that I don't have one, but nor do you, and nor does anyone else. And somehow there is a deep psychological trait that we all feel that if we don't know what the future holds, there must be somebody out there who does. Hence the temptation to subscribe to quack doctors. People are very, very willing and susceptible to take advice from people who claim to know, who seem to be authoritative. And we're not very good at challenging them because we're uncomfortable with the consequence of accepting that there is a lot of uncertainty out there. And this is, I think, why very often you do get big changes in sentiment in financial markets where people want to believe something. And if you live in a world of radical uncertainty, you're not dealing with probabilities and quantitative outcomes. You're dealing with narratives, with stories. People have narratives to explain to themselves what goes on. And very often, you believe in a narrative until something big happens to make you change that narrative. And for me, the reason why this is important in economic terms is that the sort of business cycles that we saw in the post-war period, ups and downs, were very different from the downturn that we saw in 2008, 2009, which was driven by a change in the narrative that we had about our own economies and about the world economy. And once people had said to themselves, what I was spending before the crisis was actually an unsustainable level of spending. So I'm going to cut my spending. At that point, if they have a new narrative that says, I made a mistake before, I now need to pull in the horns and rein back on my spending, it's very hard for a central bank to persuade people to deviate from that. And you may persuade them for a short period to spend today rather than tomorrow. There's a limit to how far you can do that. And it requires a different set of policies to get out of a downturn like that. I call it a narrative revision downturn. And it's very different from a Keynesian downturn. And what I find so striking and so disappointing is that most economists that you will read in newspapers and many central bank comments seem to think there's only one kind of downturn, and if we just have a bit more monetary and fiscal stimulus, then the world will be all right. And what is strange about it is that, if the proverbial person from Mars were to arrive and say, I didn't go to Chicago and do a PhD, or Harvard or anywhere else, but I've been watching the Earth from a distance, and you had this big financial crisis, and you then had the world's biggest monetary policy stimulus ever seen, and you haven't actually generated a recovery. So although I don't know anything about economics, wouldn't I be right in thinking that maybe monetary policy isn't the answer? And actually, I think that's right. But it's not the answer you'll get from conventional economics.
Really interesting. So I think we're going to open it up to questions. And I see some already.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and my colleagues with the microphones will bring the microphone to you. I will call on you. So we have one here in the front. Phil, please.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to, if I could, turn to Europe for a moment and the European Central Bank and what it's been doing. You've spoken at times about how we're asking too much of central banks. We're asking them to try and carry a whole economy. There's two possibilities. One is that that could just be ineffective. The other is that there could be sort of a mounting cost to this. Is there any problem with what the European Central Bank has been doing? You hear about Target 2 balances and the like. Or is it just simply that you believe it's not going to be as effective as everyone hopes?
Well, there are problems of a political kind in some ways. I think, in essence, the European Central Bank has been trying to hold the euro area together. And although it describes its policy in terms of reaching an inflation target, what it's actually doing is trying to help the country that's nearest the exit. And its current policy is to push the euro down and try and help countries like France see some economic growth in order to prevent what for the euro area would be a catastrophic election of Marine Le Pen next year in the presidential elections, because she's against the euro. So it's pursuing a monetary policy which is geared at that. It has the problem that, along with all central banks, the longer it's pursued monetary stimulus, the less effective it's been. And when Mario Draghi stood up in London in 2012 and said, we'll do whatever it takes, his big problem was that actually he's in no position to do whatever it takes, because he is merely the president of the European Central Bank. And what it will take to keep the euro area together is a political move to agree on, for example, a political union, a fiscal union, a genuine transfer union in which countries like Germany pay for countries in the south. So far, there is no sign of any political willingness, either of the countries in the north to give money to countries in the south, or on the part of countries in the south to accept the inevitable conditionality that would apply to those transfers. So at this stage, what they're doing is just trying to keep the show on the road. And I've often said to Mario, I said, you're doing a great job, Mario. Terrific, great performance, great success. You only made one mistake. What's that? Taking the job.
Over there in the middle.
Lord King, in the case of Enron, what happened was they prosecuted the men that committed the crimes. In the case of the banking crisis and collapse, they punished the stockholders, taking out $200 billion of equity and not sending anybody to jail. In your view, if they had prosecuted the bankers and left the stockholders alone, which would on a multiplier effect have left $2 trillion out there for lending, would the economic recovery have proceeded differently?
So I don't think it was possible to avoid significant losses to stockholders, because banks were so highly leveraged that it was inevitable that something that would lead to a loss of confidence in the banking system and the downturn in the world economy that we saw in 08-09 was bound to reduce the value of stockholders' equity. throughout history, the biggest damage done to the value of equity in bank stocks has been macroeconomic policy mistakes that lead to an adverse outcome. And the world downturn in 2009 was very damaging. I'm not a great enthusiast of sending people to jail. I understand the anger that prompts people to want to do it. But actually, my feeling is, as I look back, and I talk about this in the book, and talk about the prisoner's dilemma, that actually most people in the crisis did what they thought. You can explain their behavior by saying, what were the incentives they faced? And I think, for me, a telling example is, the very sad story in many ways of Chuck Prince, who ran Citibank, who in 2007 made this famous statement that while the music's playing, we have to go on dancing. Go back even just 4 years to 2003. Suppose Chuck Prince had said in 2003 in a speech, I've been looking very carefully at what we're doing at Citi. I think the risk is that we've probably got too much leverage. We really need to recapitalize our bank. I think many of the instruments that we're investing in and that our smart young guys are trying to sell and market, they're too risky. We're not going to do that anymore. So I'm going to have a big share issue to recapitalize the bank, and I'm going to not get involved in these instruments. It is certain that over the next 4 years, the bank would have made much lower profits than its competitors while the music was going on playing. And I very much doubt that the shareholders or the board of Citi would have allowed him to carry on as chief executive in a situation where he was following a strategy that was deliberately earning lower profits than his major competitors. So he wouldn't have been in position in 2007 to make the statement that he did. So I don't find it fruitful to blame people for what happened. I think, for me, because of the world was so unknowable, radical uncertainty, things happened for which the system was ill-prepared. And we should all take responsibility for it. The nature of the banking system, with the possibility of bank runs, was a major problem. The imbalances in the world economy were a major problem. The imbalance between spending and saving within our own economies, leading to this tremendous fall in interest rates, ending in a position where real interest rates are zero, which I think is incompatible with the successful operation of a market economy. No one country, no one institution, and certainly no one individual is to blame for that. And yet, after the crisis, the very people who were lionized before the crisis, whether it's bankers or whether it was Alan Greenspan, then everyone says, well, it's obvious now, these people were criminal and we should put them in jail. I don't think this is remotely sensible or rational or the right way to do it. And what we ought to do is to say, were the ideas that we had before the crisis the right ones or not? Should we learn from the crisis? It's not a question of saying, as I said before, it was easy for me as a student, with the benefit of hindsight, to look back at the 1930s and say, well, I knew these people were stupid. That they allowed the Great Depression to happen. I don't do that anymore. And I think it's very important not to allow hindsight to color the way we approach it. The rational approach, to my mind, is to say, well, we've learned a lot from this crisis, and we owe it to our grandchildren. The book is dedicated to my grandchildren, because I don't want them to have to go through another crisis and say, actually, we knew what we should do after the previous crisis. It was all in the end of alchemy, but we didn't actually do it. I would like us to do it now.
We're here in the fourth row.
Hi, Lord King. Thank you very much for your time. You mentioned a few things. When you were finishing talking, you mentioned about how further stimulus from the central banks just basically decreases the influence that the central banks have with their policies on the broader economy. And you also mentioned about sometimes like not knowing exactly what's going to happen. I guess my question is the following. If we go back to Alan Greenspan not acknowledging that there was a bubble building up during in the housing market, and then in the aftermath, the banks being bailed out, because again, we all know they were too big to fail and all of that. I don't know, it brings me back to an article, a very small article I read in the Wall Street Journal about, it was in the beginning of the 20th century, about a guy just sweeping the streets, and the title was Panic. And and what struck me was that before, the word panic would have a more positive connotation. It was more about cleaning the streets, right? Like just to getting rid of the inefficient and the redundant, right? Whereas nowadays, panic is a bad thing, and then the central banks are very quick to just jump in and rescue everybody, right? Like, as you mentioned, Mario Draghi just increasing the stimulus package to $80 billion and so on and so forth. Now, my feeling is, again, with the last Fed announcement from Yellen just saying that they would raise interest rate twice in the year rather than 4 times, basically submitting to market force expectations, is that central banks are really actually losing the influence they have on the broader economy. And in fact, by...
Can you come to the question? I'm losing track of the...
Yeah, sorry, I guess my question is the following in plain vanilla is, should central banks even have the influence they have because of the distortions that they've created on the markets? Or should we focus on reducing the role of central banks just as governments to let the infinite market players make the decision for themselves, so that we, for example...
Can I answer the question?
Yeah, of course.
So there's a whole chapter on central banks in the book. And I say, well, let's try and keep this very simple. The role of central banks is to decide how much money we need in the economy. Money is a social institution. How much money do we need? And in good times, that's monetary policy. The central bank has to create enough money to ensure economic growth can continue, but not so much that you get inflation. In bad times, the role of the central bank is to create enough money or liquidity so that the system doesn't collapse. Because when there is a crisis of confidence, most people want to rush into something called money or liquidity that's safe, because they don't quite know what they want to do in the future. They want to have somewhere where they can think without committing to decisions on spending for the future. So the essence of a central bank is how much money to create. And if you see it in those terms, and I think whether it's monetary policy or financial stability are 2 sides of the same coin. The reason we need central banks, and this is why it's important we have them, is that since whether there is or is not a crisis of confidence or panic is not predictable, is not determined by physical laws of nature that we can discover with ever more precise mathematical models, but the result of human behavior, we need a human institution to be able to respond. And that's why just relying on gold as a monetary standard does not make sense, because gold is fixed in supply and it can't respond when there's a panic. It's why something like Bitcoin is a bit of a mirage, because who knows what the algorithm of Bitcoin will mean, or whether someone else will create a digital currency. And abolishing the central bank isn't going to help either. We need to have a collective institution. Now, it could be government, it could be an independent central bank. We can debate that, and we can debate accountability and the mandate we give central banks. But deep down, in order to make a market economy work, to end the alchemy, to get the hang of money and banking, as my Chinese friend said, we need a central bank that can both manage the price level so we don't get wild inflations. Remember, it's only in the 1970s when, now for you that may be a long time ago, but I remember the 1970s. In Britain we had 27% a year inflation. That wasn't because people were stupid. It's because we lost control. We had the wrong ideas. And ideas do drive things, and they matter. And now we should learn from the crisis, having had a big crisis, that we can not only control the price level, supply money in good times, we have to learn how to do it in bad times as well.
Okay, over here in the 3rd row, and please make your question a question and not a comment.
Lord King, when you came to visit us last year, just coming back again to the question of whether monetary policy can do everything, you did note last year that monetary policy can't do everything, and really, especially in Europe, we need structural reforms to really get to where we want to be. And it seems that perhaps getting through the Greek crisis, okay, or at least to this point, and the European recovery kind of getting underway, at least on some level, that perhaps the political will to engage in structural reform has been stymied a bit. In my mind, it seems that the progress has been scant. And I'm curious about, kind of how you look at that and whether you think that, kind of the issues that we have in Europe are somewhat permanent because once Draghi is able to actually, have an impact, once the central bank is able to have an impact and things improve a bit, the political will to make structural changes decreases. So they seem to work inversely, and are we kind of in that kind of trap where nothing will actually really change?
Well, I think I'm more pessimistic than you in that remark because I don't think it's reasonable to expect structural reforms in a situation where you've got mass unemployment. That is not an environment where it's easy to persuade people to undertake major structural reforms. And what we have is a position now in which, because countries that joined monetary union lost competitiveness against Germany in the first decade of monetary union, they are now trapped in a situation where either they have to have mass unemployment in a desperate attempt to push down money wages, or Germany is going to have to bail them out, not just for a few years, but in perpetuity. I don't think any of these options are remotely attractive to people in Europe. There is no good outcome now. And there is a battle between the political will of the current elite in the euro area to keep the show on the road and the inevitable logic of economic arithmetic. In the end, not easy to judge which of these is going to be the more powerful, but arithmetic is quite strong in this. And if you look at the position in Greece, it has not improved. There will come a point in the next 2 or 3 years when even this Greek government loses popular support because the situation is not improving. Young people are leaving. I never imagined at any point in my career that we would see a repetition in the industrialized world of the Great Depression that you saw here in the 1930s. And yet what's happened in Greece in the last few years is actually worse than the fall in GDP and spending that you saw in the United States in the 1930s. How can that be? When now we've got, we've studied economics, all these modern ideas and theories, but we have we've allowed a situation to develop in which, because of the monetary union in Europe, Greece is suffering even more than the United States did in the 1930s. That should make us very nervous about the stability of the monetary union.
We have one over there in the middle. Yes.
I'm sure you wrote about this in your book, but unfortunately I haven't read your book. But I will after this. But could you share your thoughts on, is a fiat currency structure just too much for humans to handle? Should we go back to a pegged currency standard like gold or something like that?
So I do talk about it in the bank, and let me suggest you buy early and buy often. So the reason why I understand the attractions of a non-fiat currency because it removes the decision about how much money to create from government. And there's no doubt that going through history from ancient times until today, that governments have a pretty poor track record of managing a monetary standard. However, I do think that at least in the industrialized world, with inflation targeting, it's not a magic solution by any means, but we were developing an approach to central banking policy and accountability where the independence of central banks combined with sufficient transparency and accountability to Congress or Parliament was leading us in a direction where we could manage the monetary standard satisfactorily. The big problem with a non-fiat standard is what I mentioned just now. which is that there are times when there's a crisis when you need to have a sudden expansion of the money supply to meet a big demand for liquidity. And of course, in due course, to contract the amount of money in order to prevent that from turning ultimately into inflation. And that requires discretionary management by someone. It can't be achieved by a gold standard or any other non-automatic, any other automatic standard. And I think for that reason, we shouldn't rely on a gold standard. And it is very telling that the history of the UK to the 19th and 20th century was a belief that we ought to be on the gold standard, but each time there was a crisis in the banking sector, we temporarily left the gold standard. And I think the right way of doing it is to try and get to a system where we, develop inflation targeting and the discretionary management of the price level through an independent central bank, but allow that independent central bank to be not the old-fashioned lender of last resort, but the new pawnbroker for all seasons.
Over there. No.
Thank you, Lord King. I would like your opinion on negative interest rates. From a simplistic perspective, interest rates as a measure of risk, it just doesn't make much sense to me. And then also you mentioned that monetary policy is not the answer. So what is your prescription to take us out of emergency financial and monetary policy situations?
Well, I think you're right. It is quite difficult to make sense of negative interest rates. And it's very hard to see how a market economy can function in that way. I mean, it does hold out the attractive prospect of receiving a letter from one's bank saying, dear Mr. King, we are very grateful that you have chosen to borrow from us. And as a token of our appreciation, we enclose a check for $1,022 to compensate you for the burden of borrowing from us. But when you see it like that, you realize that this is an act of desperation. And it's being done, I think, less because central banks really think that this is the right thing to do, and more because the announcement effect of negative interest rates might weaken the currency. And I think we're in a situation now where most countries in the world can quite credibly say, if only the rest of the world was growing normally, we'd be fine. But since it isn't, we aren't. So maybe in these circumstances, the right thing to do is, in the short run at least, just focus on depressing the currency. I think it's clearly what Japan has been doing. I think it's what the ECB is doing. I understand why they deny it, but the effect of what they're doing is to depress the currency. And of course, so far, the only currency against which all these other ones are going down is the US dollar. And now, of course, you see the Fed start to worry about the impact on the US economy of too strong a dollar. So this is going to be a counterproductive measure. Now, I don't think there's any quick fix to where we are. I think we've got ourselves into a serious disequilibrium with real interest rates at zero instead of being at a healthy 3 to 4% a year. I think we've got to find a path back to a situation where it will then be sensible for central banks gradually to start raising rates to get back to where we need to be. And that requires a number of things, in my view. It means freeing up exchange rates, getting back to allowing exchange rates to give market signals. It means a serious and protracted program of reforms to boost productivity in the future in order to give people confidence that incomes in the future will be higher than now, and hence to validate some of the debt that was taken on. It means the promotion of trade, because one of the experiences of the post-war period was that the expansion of trade did help to boost productivity and growth. It was a win-win situation. And I think ultimately it means some sort of international cooperation, not artificial coordination of exchange rates or interest rates, but a recognition that if we expect, say, China to rebalance its economy, to switch from an export-led growth model to domestic demand stimulus, if we expect China to do that, they're much more likely to be willing to do it if they think that we too are going to rebalance our economy. And we'll be more likely to take the measures to rebalance our economy if we think that they are going to be doing the same thing. So it's not that there are specific measures we need to agree on or have some great conference, but we do need to agree and at least have confidence in each other that over some period, whether it be 5 years or 8 years or 10 years, I don't know, the IMF should be leading the way on this, that if we believe that other countries over that time period will be making a serious effort to rebalance their economies, then it makes it much more likely that we will have confidence that it's the right thing for us to do to rebalance our economy as well. And I think that's the last bit of the jigsaw that we've made very little progress on.
And we have time for one more question. Right here in front, please.
With the low-growth economy in Europe that we have now and the turmoil in the EU, what are the risks to England?
Well, there's no doubt that if the European economy grows slowly, that is a big problem for the UK. And indeed, in 2010, we were probably the only industrialized country that did embark on a major attempt to rebalance our economy. Why? Because, not consciously, but as a result of the crisis, sterling had fallen by 25%, biggest depreciation of sterling in the post-war period. That was going to boost our trade, other things being equal. And so it was the right time to embark on a process in which the government could put in place gradual fiscal consolidation to rein in domestic spending, both public and private, knowing that the fall in the exchange rate would boost net exports and would rebalance. The trouble is, just as I said now, the rest of Europe didn't rebalance their economy, and the European economy grew slowly. If it had grown at a normal rate, we'd have been fine, but it didn't. And I think this is an example where, to coin a phrase, we are all in it together, and it doesn't benefit any of us for another part of the world economy to grow slowly or have major problems. But equally, it's very difficult for any one country to get out of it on its own. You know, if you try and expand your own economy too quickly, you may just get a big trade deficit. We need the rest of the world to grow as well. So I think we're in this position where, without working together, it's going to be hard to get out of it. But to end on a note of optimism, there are two reasons why we should be really optimistic, not about the short term, where I am rather pessimistic, but about the long term. The first is that in most of the industrialized world, our national income is about 15% below where it would have been had we not had a crisis. That means that if we can find a way, not just to continue with monetary stimulus, but to put in place the measures to rebalance our economy and other world economies, that there is a tremendous opportunity in the next 20-odd years to grow faster than we could normally do by making up this gap of 15%. In the 1930s, people became very pessimistic about the future. The fact is, if you go back to 1930 and just extrapolate US GDP from 1930, by 1950-55, bang on that line again. It was as if the Great Depression hadn't happened, not in the sense that there wasn't suffering in the 30s, but in the sense that it didn't have any permanent impact on the potential of the US economy. And that's absolutely true today as well. And the second reason for optimism is, unlike some American economists who seem, in very uncharacteristic American fashion, to believe that the future is bleak because we'll never get the kind of inventions we had in the past, I think this is completely wrong. Everybody I know who works in science, technology, believes this is a golden age of scientific discovery. The idea that what is going on in universities, Silicon Valley, around the world, stem cell research, isn't going to feed through to new ideas that, because of radical uncertainty, we can't imagine today. But because we can't imagine them today, doesn't mean to say that they won't come through in the future. That's what inventions are all about. And if you look at the period, the reason I asked my Chinese friend about the Industrial Revolution was that basically total GDP was flat around the world for 1,000 years before. Slowly it started to grow. Low rates, first in Britain, faster rates in Europe in the 19th century, even faster rates in the United States when the US took up the baton of being at the technological frontier. We haven't seen a period where productivity growth in countries at the frontiers has actually fallen back significantly. And I don't think we'll see it now. So I think that productivity growth in the future will be buoyant, but we're not facing a normal business cycle downturn. We will need to restructure and rebalance our economies, and that will take some time. But once we've done that, and once central banks have been able to get interest rates back to normal levels, then there should be, I think, a period of faster growth and prosperity of a kind that we haven't seen for quite a while. And I hope by that stage we will have learned how to get the hang of money and banking.
And on that positive note, please join me in thanking Lord King will sign book.